Imagine scrolling through social media and stumbling upon a tweet from none other than Elon Musk. It reads, "Free Tommy Robinson. Starmer was complicit in the of Britain when he was the head of Crown prosecution for 6 years. Starmer must go, and he must face charges for his complicity in the worst mass crime in the history of Britain."
What this was, which was the biggest crime carried out in modern British history.
Charges that were levied at the men who were raping dozens of children on a daily basis were painfully inadequate.
Well, the UK's gang scandal has now become a global scandal, which it always ought to have been. Elon Musk has amplified very grim details.
The words land like an explosion, accusing one of Britain's most powerful politicians, Sir Keir Starmer, of failing those he was sworn to protect. In an instant, a long-buried scandal resurfaces, one of the worst child abuse cover-ups in British history. Thousands of children were left defenseless while those in power looked the other way.
Girls were killed, girls were set on fire. Girls endured fake executions, real executions.
But was this failure just incompetence or something far worse? Because make no mistake, this didn't happen by accident. Someone let this happen. Someone protected the predators instead of the victims.
Always, the state will prioritize human rights of the perpetrators over those of the victims.
And even now, they're scrambling to keep it buried.
You know, you've got council officials, social workers, police, politicians, who's all know stuff, that's covered it up. And I can't wait for the day when they're all exposed and locked up.
This is Britain's darkest scandal, one they never wanted you to know about.
1 in 7 of the men in some of these communities was directly involved. And that meant everyone knew about it. Absolutely everyone.
The story begins in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the UK. In cities like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford, local charities and social workers started seeing a pattern. White British girls as young as 8, many from troubled backgrounds or already in the care system, were being abused by gangs of predominantly Pakistani males. This included systematic sexual abuse, gang rape, and trafficking. Time and again, these girls and their advocates tried to report the crimes, but instead of justice, they were met with indifference, or worse, dismissal. A horrific story told here by Douglas Murray, a renowned British political commentator, gives insight into these occurrences.
It turned out that the local care authorities had failed on multiple occasions. On one occasion, there was a girl that was meant to be in their care. She had been drugged and groomed and gang raped by a group of Muslim men in Oxford repeatedly. And one night, she managed to escape in a cab and got back to her care home that was overseen by the local council. And when she got there, she couldn't pay for the fare. And the people at the care home who had a duty of care over her didn't pay the fare. The girl's rapists came back and found her and took her away again and did it again.
These were not isolated incidents. It was part of a systemic pattern of abuse that spanned decades and affected thousands of children all across Britain. The grooming gangs operated with chilling efficiency. They would target vulnerable girls, often from white working-class families, and lure them with gifts, drugs, and alcohol. Once the girls were trapped, they were subjected to unimaginable horrors, passed around like commodities, threatened with violence, and silenced by fear.
One girl had the initials of her abuser branded with a hot iron on the cheeks. Branded on her, literally made to be property to an abuser.
Despite overwhelming evidence, authorities turned a blind eye. Social workers, police, and local councils all did nothing to help out of fear. These girls were abandoned by the very system meant to protect them. And as we'll see, this betrayal went all the way to the top. In a shocking clip, Maggie Oliver, the former Greater Manchester police detective who helped uncover widespread abuse in Rochdale, talks about just how flawed this system is.
And I can remember him saying to me, Maggie, calm down. Look, let's be honest, what are these kids ever going to contribute to society? They should have been drowned at birth. And it just made me sick to my stomach. And I thought, if somebody like that is running this job, what hope have we got of supporting them and treating them humanely? And that was one of the first signals that things were not being done properly.
Reports from as early as the 1970s hint at these issues in Britain. But it wasn't until the early 2010s, thanks to journalists like Andrew Norfolk of The Times, that the scandal received widespread attention. One of his most significant collaborations was with Risky Business, a Rotherham youth project led by Jane Sr. Together, they uncovered the tragic story of Laura, a 17-year-old girl who was murdered by her Muslim boyfriend after she revealed their relationship to his family. Their investigations revealed that Laura's case wasn't isolated. It was part of a broader, systemic pattern. Among the cases they uncovered, a teenage girl was brutally assaulted with a broken bottle. A 12-year-old girl with a mental age of 8 and an IQ of 58 was repeatedly raped by multiple men. When she tried to report the abuse, social workers dismissed her as promiscuous. A 12-year-old girl was found drunk and half-naked in a house surrounded by Asian men. Instead of arresting the men, the police arrested the girl. In Rotherham, one child victim was abused by over 100 different men over the course of several years. Andrew Norfolk and other journalists who exposed the scandal received death threats and were accused of stirring up racial tensions.
As for the police, they not only dismissed all criticism, but publicly accused the Times of exploiting the victims.
These stories were shocking, but they were just the beginning. Then came the infamous Rotherham case.
Simon, this is a truly terrible story with a shocking number of children involved. How did this happen?
Since the Rotherham scandal broke last week, very few people who were central to events there have spoken out.
When Alexis J's report came out, it weren't even national news, it weren't international, it were worldwide news. And the world woke up to what we are now probably known as the worst child abuse scandal in the modern world.
The scale of the abuse there was beyond what anyone had imagined. In 2014, Professor Alexis J. released what became known as the J Report, revealing that at least 1,400 children were sexually exploited in Rotherham alone between 1997 and 2013. But experts believe the actual number could be much higher. The details were stomach-churning: abductions, gang rape, threats to family members, and girls being treated like commodities, passed from one abuser to another. The report didn't just expose the scale of the abuse, it also highlighted the systemic failures of police, social services, and local councils, who were so concerned about being called racist that they failed to protect the young girls that needed it.
The Alexis J report is a report that was published in August 2014, and this was a report that was actually started from my own story being published in the Times newspaper. Now, it was a one-year investigation to get the report findings, and it showed that there was a minimum of 1,400 children in my hometown in a certain period of time that had been groomed, abused, raped, tortured, trafficked, and some even murdered. And that the majority of perpetrators were Pakistani Muslim men. A majority of victims were white, non-religious female children. It also showed how the failings of social workers within the council, and it also shared our stories of what we'd actually been through and how people didn't protect us because there was fears of being called racist or Islamophobic.
Soon, similar stories surfaced from other towns. Rochdale, where a 2012 court case led to 9 men being convicted. Telford, where a 2018 investigation suggested up to 1,000 girls had been abused over several decades, making it one of the worst affected areas. Similar stories were found in Oxford, Huddersfield, and Newcastle, each revealing more survivors. Later reports showed that this wasn't confined to a few towns, it happened in more than 50 towns across Britain. Many survivors of these grooming gangs continue to suffer from PTSD, substance abuse, and broken relationships, decades after the abuse.
What is it like every day, though, living with what happened to you?
A torment, yeah. I have to relive it and have to deal with panic attacks, and it's torment. I've been tormented and I'll probably carry on being tormented. It's really bad.
It's hard to trust anybody and get close to anyone. You have attachment problems with it's not just relationships, it's with everybody in your life.
Yeah.
Thanks to the work of journalists and whistleblowers, the scandal could no longer be ignored. But as we'll see, the fight for justice was far from over. Despite repeated reports and overwhelming evidence, entire institutions, including the police, social services, and local councils, turned a blind eye to the grooming gang scandal. A 2012 report by the Home Affairs Select Committee found that police and social services repeatedly ignored warnings about grooming gangs due to fears of being labeled racist or Islamophobic. Authorities often described perpetrators vaguely as men of a certain ethnicity, avoiding specific ethnic labels. This reluctance to confront cultural and racial issues directly created a dangerous trade-off. Protecting minority sentiments came at the expense of vulnerable girls' safety. A 2013 report by the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, revealed that police and social workers avoided using terms like Asian or Pakistani to describe perpetrators, fearing accusations of racism.
I think the term Asian isn't always appropriate. When we do look at, again, the demographic of perpetrators, we are seeing that they're mostly British Pakistanis.
I know that these gangs are often referred to as Asian grooming gangs, but I would always say, well, I have yet to come across any man from Thailand or Japan or China who are involved in these grooming gangs. They are predominantly Pakistani, British, Muslim men. And that is not racist, it is a fact.
We must talk about who did it. And here's who did it. It was men, Pakistani Muslim men, right?
In many cases, statistics on ethnicity were deliberately not collected, making it harder to understand the problem and take action. This failure to acknowledge specific ethnic backgrounds and gather detailed data further fueled the problem, allowing grooming gangs to operate unchecked. A 2014 investigation found that police officers were told to focus on diversity training rather than investigating grooming gangs, as it was seen as a higher priority. In one shocking instance, authorities suggested offering a 12-year-old victim language lessons, presumably to help her communicate with her abusers, rather than addressing the abuse itself. This wasn't just negligence, it was a systemic failure that allowed these predators to operate.
And then I campaigned for 3 years solid on child abuse issues, whether it be Cyril Smith, historic abuse, but also the grooming scandals that were occurring across the country. And I raised lots of issues in Parliament and elsewhere on those issues. So that's the context. But what surprised me more than anything, really, is that I had senior politicians tell me not to mention the ethnicity or religious bias of those perpetrators. So the first example...
Who was that? Was that?
Yeah, so first instance was Jim Dobbin, who was the MP for Harewood and Middleton at the time.
Right.
And he said to me at some function, because we attend the same functions, listen, don't mention the ethnicity, there's no advantage to it, it'll affect the Labour vote. And he was quite clear.
So they said that, it would affect the Labour vote?
He was quite clear about that. That was his advice to me.
Outrageous.
He's a much older MP, I'd been there for 2 years, I was very new, and he probably thought he was giving me some good advice.
Police failures were a critical component of the scandal. Despite clear evidence and numerous complaints, officers consistently failed to take action. In some cases, victims were arrested instead of their abusers, further traumatizing those seeking help. In one harrowing case, a father was arrested for trying to rescue his daughters from an abuse situation. Authorities told him, "Go home. If you return to that flat, we will arrest you for stalking."
So they were watching this flat where your daughter was being abused. They weren't going in to save her, but they did go in to arrest you.
Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah. They arrested me second time, took me down at the police station, kept me in there. About an hour and a half later, they come into, because they didn't put me in a cell, they put me in a room. They took me out of the room, took me out through the police station, into the front bit with public, go to report crimes. Took me outside and said, right, go home, because if you go back to that flat, we're going to arrest you for stalking. And I don't know if you know or not, but there's serious new stalking laws coming, and we'll arrest you for stalking the occupants of that house.
In Rochdale, a 13-year-old victim became pregnant, and DNA evidence identified her abuser. Despite this, the police refused to arrest him, claiming the case was too complex.
I was reapproached in 2010 and asked to go on board a case in Rochdale, which became known as Operation Span.
Maggie was asked to join the team to gain the trust of a young girl called Ruby, who, aged just 12, had been raped by known paedophile Adil Khan.
When she was just 13, she had been made pregnant by that man. And the police at the time, which had been 2 years previous to that, had seized a fetus.
But despite having the frozen fetus and the DNA needed to prove the identity of Ruby's rapist, Adil Khan was not charged with.
Ruby, you know, we had a fetus. We knew who had made her pregnant, but the authorities failed to protect her. The schools knew, social services knew, the police knew. And even though we all knew, even though we had DNA, even though we knew who was responsible, that man was still never charged.
Later investigations revealed even more appalling statements from authorities. One father was told that the abuse would teach his daughter a lesson. Another was told that an Asian boyfriend was a fashion accessory for girls like his daughter, and that she would eventually grow out of it. Not a single officer has been fired for these failures. This systemic betrayal went all the way to the top, leaving thousands of children defenseless. But the system's failures didn't end with ignoring the problem. Even when abusers were caught, the justice system often delivered weak or no consequences, leaving victims and their families without justice and allowing many offenders to walk free, still a danger to others. Many were not prosecuted. In Rotherham, a 2014 report revealed that only 1 in 10 reported cases of child exploitation resulted in a conviction. Many grooming gang offenders received shockingly lenient sentences. For example, Adil Khan, a key figure in the Rochdale scandal, was sentenced to just 8 years but released after serving only half his sentence. As of 2025, only a fraction of the perpetrators have been brought to justice, and the scars of this scandal continue to haunt Britain. Many share the opinion that people involved in grooming gangs, especially those with dual nationality, should lose their British citizenship and be sent back to their home country to prevent them from committing more crimes in the UK. However, this plan is difficult because the UK's immigration system is slow and ineffective, making it hard to deport these offenders quickly. Many of them use legal appeals to fight their deportation, and some even give up their birth citizenship so they can stay in the UK. Additionally, countries like Pakistan often refuse to accept these criminals back, worrying about bringing gang into their country. Because of these problems, many criminals remain in the UK and continue to pose a threat to vulnerable people.
The answers to this are, as I said in The Spectator this week, pretty straightforward, actually. They're that if a man is found to have been grooming gang women or underage girls, that person should go to prison for a very long time. And if they have dual nationality, they should be chucked out of the UK. They should have their British nationality withdrawn, and they should be deported. Now, most of these men should be deported back to Pakistan, but the immigration system in Britain is so rotten that, as I mentioned again in The Spectator this week, a number of the men who were released from prison early used the time to appeal against their deportation and used that time to give up their Pakistani citizenship so they could stay in the UK, because it takes so long to get people out of the UK. And in the end, nobody does get sent out of the UK. Oh, and then a couple of cases where people actually were able to be returned to Pakistan. Shock and horror, the Pakistani government didn't want more gangsters in Pakistan, so they didn't receive them back. Well, any sensible government should say, you know what, Pakistan, we give you millions of pounds a year in foreign aid, as does our ally, the United States of America. You'll take your citizens back. You'll take them back. Otherwise, you can say bye-bye to any foreign aid or anything else.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps a growing channel like mine. Got more great content coming your way, so stay tuned. To understand the grooming gang scandal, we need to look at the bigger picture: Britain's changing demographics and cultural landscape. Over the last 20 years, Britain has seen a massive influx of immigrants, especially from Muslim-majority countries. Between 1997 and 2020, around 7 million people moved to the UK, significantly altering the country's population.
Births are declining, society is ageing, but the British population is growing, and it's growing a lot, and there's only one reason for that: immigration. The UK is on course to have the highest migration rate in Europe. From 2022 to 2032, the population is going to go up from 67.6 million to 72.5 million, according to projections.
This has put pressure on housing, schools, and public services. Many Britons feel frustrated, especially since the government has struggled to control immigration, even after Brexit, which was supposed to reduce it.
The Britain I grew up in was the most peaceful, the most gentle, homogenous society that has ever existed. That has been destroyed.
Do you think there should be more immigration or less?
Less. You should stop it.
And not putting all these people into hotels when we've got our own people
struggling, living on the streets is absolutely disgraceful.
In certain urban areas, parallel communities have formed, where people mostly live apart from the wider society and refuse to integrate, and after spending many years in Britain don't even speak English. Shockingly, between 2001 and 2011, the Pakistani-born population in the UK increased by over 70%, leading to the formation of isolated communities in some areas. In cities like London and Birmingham, white British residents now make up less than 50% of the population, according to the 2021 census. This lack of assimilation can perpetuate harmful cultural practices and create resistance to adopting British laws and social norms, leading to conflicts and abuses. When communities remain isolated, it becomes harder to address systemic issues like grooming gangs, which often thrive in environments where integration has failed.
Very simple. No integration, no multiculturalism, no diversity, no tolerance. I got my own deen, you got your own deen. You got your democracy, we got our own sharia. You got your own free mixing, we got our own nikah. Own cheating within the marketplace, your own credit cards. We got our own economic system. We got our own foreign policy. We got our own deen.
As Britain changes, the Muslim population is growing rapidly, and experts think it could reach 20% of the total population by 2050. This growth has brought new cultural and political challenges. The presence of over 85 Sharia courts in the UK has sparked huge debate, with critics arguing that they sometimes conflict with British laws on gender equality. These courts are controversial because they often normalize practices like polygamy and unequal rights for women. A recent poll by Policy Exchange found that 3/4 of British Muslims believed Sharia law should play a role in the UK, which can be perceived as very alarming.
Eradicating the non-Islamic law from the Arabian Peninsula. We hope one day to eradicate the Islamic law from Britain, and with the generations to come from the rest of the world, to fulfill the prophecy of the Prophet that the whole of the world will one day be under the authority of the Muslims.
But this is not just the UK, this is happening all around Europe. Just a few months ago in Hamburg, a massive rally of Muslim men marched through the streets, shouting for Sharia law. Grooming gangs in Britain are often linked to specific cultural and demographic backgrounds. In the UK, many offenders are of Pakistani or Bangladeshi descent. But this is not just the UK's problem. In other European countries, similar crimes are committed by men from North African and Middle Eastern communities. For example, in the Netherlands, young Moroccan men are disproportionately represented in grooming gang cases. And in Germany, a 2020 report found that 90% of child sexual exploitation cases in some cities involved migrants, primarily from these regions.
A leaked police report from Dusseldorf shows Arab refugees are behind an explosion of rapes and sexual abuse cases against children in Germany. Since the number of migrants from oppressive Muslim countries has grown, the report finds the number of sexual attacks have soared.
Similarly, in Sweden, a 2018 investigation revealed that over 90% of convicted rapists were born outside the country, sparking a national debate about immigration and integration.
Take the money and leave, please. The Swedish government is offering to pay immigrants $34,000 if they go back to their home country. The Conservative government's migration minister said that this is part of a paradigm shift in Sweden's migration policy.
These gangs typically target vulnerable girls, often from white working-class backgrounds. They exploit cultural norms that blame Western women for sexual violence, treating their victims as if they're disposable. In some cases, grooming gang members justified their actions by claiming that Western women were uncovered meat, a phrase reportedly used in court testimonies.
There is a specific problem which involves Pakistani heritage men who target vulnerable young white girls, and they see these young women, white girls who are vulnerable, some of them in care, who they think are easy meat.
In 2016, a National Crime Agency report revealed that Pakistani men in Britain were disproportionately represented in grooming gang statistics. In Rotherham, 1 in every 73 Pakistani men over 16 was brought to court for these crimes.
You talk about moderate Muslims. Like, I looked up the polling data today that Winston Marshall, for example, referred to when he interviewed Nigel Farage. And, you know, it's about 3/4 of UK Muslims would be perfectly content if Sharia law happened to be the, the principle of the day for the UK as a whole. and that it would be fine if Islam became the national religion. Now, that's 75%. So, a cynic would say, okay, just exactly where the hell are these moderates? And at minimum, their voice needs to be amplified. And then we could also point out that the participation in these by members of the Pakistani Muslim community, it was like 1 in 7 of the men in some of these communities was directly involved. And that meant everyone knew about it, absolutely everyone on the Pakistani Muslim side. And the moderates were certainly, silent and complicit. Now, obviously, so were the authorities. And so that's a complete bloody catastrophe for everyone involved. But there's a serious conversation to be had in the West, and particularly in the UK, maybe France and Germany in secondary place, about just exactly how it is that liberal Western democracies, with their emphasis on the rights of women, can live side by side with Islam in general, especially the sort of Islam that's transformed into enabling fundamentalism that allows this sort of criminality on the part of the psychopathic, resentful psychopathic sadists.
European governments, including the UK, have struggled to integrate immigrant communities effectively, leading to what some describe as a clash of civilizations. Because of this, bad behavior that was once criticized in Muslim-majority countries is now happening in Europe too. Cultural norms from some immigrant communities, like the emphasis on family honor and control over women, have clashed with Western values of equality and individual freedom.
Some say grooming gangs originate from a particular region of Pakistan, but others point out that the Quran encourages Muslims to take enemy women as slaves, and that Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old wife. ISIS defends sexual slavery as Islamic, saying enslaving the families of the infidels and taking their women as concubines is a firmly established aspect of the Sharia, or Islamic law.
This clash has made it harder to address issues like grooming gangs, as authorities fear being labeled racist or Islamophobic. But by avoiding these tough conversations, they've allowed the problem to grow. As Ayan Hirsi Ali, a former Muslim and prominent activist, has pointed out, Western societies often hesitate to tackle these issues directly due to fears of being labeled Islamophobic.
So there's all this tiptoeing around Muslim minorities for various reasons. But for whatever the trade-off is to sacrifice these young, vulnerable women, it is for Europe and Western societies to give up their commitment to the protection of children and women. And it's awful, and it's shameful, and it needs to stop. But we live in this post-Christian world where morality itself has become quite diffuse. A lot of people just really take it for granted that you don't and that you don't attack women on the streets, and we have laws that protect us, and we will lean on the police, and so it's always someone else's problem. It's also an emasculated society. A real man is seen as a man who will absolutely not tolerate for his women or children to be attacked. And so when people with that mindset, they come to Europe and they watch European men stand by sometimes as these attacks are happening, and a society that doesn't respond to it, that has in fact put in place so-called hate crimes or whatever to cover up the deeds itself, what it does is it encourages these people. And so the perception of Britain, whether it's real or not, from the side of the perpetrators is that the women are for the taking and the men are emasculated, they are weak, and they can't defend their women. And so there is nothing to stop them. What would be done to you in Britain if you were to devote your time to trying to bring it to the public eye, what happens to these young victims? You'd be vilified as a racist. You would probably be thrown in prison like Tommy Robinson for breaking the code of silence that we've built around these issues.
Within some Asian communities, there has been a noticeable silence around the grooming gang scandal. The fear of stigma, backlash, or being ostracized has often prevented victims and whistleblowers from speaking out. This silence has allowed the cycle of abuse to continue. Many of these men pleaded not guilty and were welcomed back into their communities after their release. This lack of accountability has fueled anger and frustration among the British public. This refusal to speak out raises tough questions. Has the refusal to accept responsibility within these communities influenced the attitudes of men who commit these crimes? And what role do cultural practices like cousin marriages or strict family honor codes play in perpetuating these issues?
I took a sabbatical from the Times and Sunday Times to do some research on cousin marriage. I think this is a scandal in this country. I read your piece on it. Very high proportion of people having cousin marriage. There are problems with cultural integration because when you marry cousins, you stay within a sequestered group and you don't integrate effectively. Also congenital difficulties because of genetic recessive disorders. I would phone scientists who had written papers. I wouldn't get a call back. They were worried about talking about...
Terrified of putting their...
Because it's predominantly Pakistani community. And there was a piece of evidence in a paper that I found out off the record that showed very high rates of incest from the UK Biobank in the Pakistani community. Tremendously important information for social services and beyond, but it was not published because the ethics committee thought that it might inflame racial tension.
The question remains, should these communities be more vocal in condemning these crimes? Silence comes at a cost. Without open dialogue and accountability, these crimes will continue to harm vulnerable girls and damage community relations. Among those who sought to expose the grooming gang scandal was Tommy Robinson, a controversial activist known for his outspoken stance against what he sees as systemic failures in addressing sexual abuse within Muslim communities.
My cousin was and she was found naked running from the Muslim community, aged 13. The police wouldn't help. All the police would say is she's a drug addict. She was a drug addict because they got her hooked on drugs after grooming and her.
Robinson gained national attention by claiming that both mainstream media and public authorities were complicit in hiding these crimes. His campaign focused on what he called Islamic extremism in Britain, particularly highlighting grooming gangs.
One of the victims had the M, the letter M, inscribed in with a burning hot iron mark on her bum, M, because she'd become the property of Muhammad. Another girl had her tongue nailed to a table. There's another court case now with 17 Muslim men who are in court for the prostitution and rape of young 12-year-old English white girls. The country needs to wake up. It's coming to a country near you. And the sickening thought is that many Muslims would have come into this mosque and prayed, they'd have walked straight out of the mosque and they'd have gone and took turns with their sexual slave. That's the reality of what's happening.
Opinions on Robinson are deeply divided. Some view him as a necessary voice advocating for justice and British rights. Others label him a far-right extremist whose rhetoric fuels division communities.
Leaders in this country.
You're sounding like a bigoted lunatic.
No, I'm not.
Somebody that basically, you are an Islamophobe who hates Islam.
No, I don't.
You basically think all Muslims are to blame.
No.
We've seen you on video saying it. And what you're doing now is deliberately inflammatory. It is deliberately poisonous.
How's this inflammatory?
And you are having the complete opposite effect to the one that you say you have.
William Gladstone.
You are stirring up hatred. You are abusing people's religion. You're abusing their faith. And you're being a complete disgrace.
What do you know about the Prophet Muhammad?
Regardless of these polarized views, Robinson undeniably played a role in bringing the grooming scandal into the national spotlight at a time when few were willing to confront. So, is Tommy Robinson a hero for exposing the scandal, or does his controversial approach do more harm than good? Another figure under scrutiny is Keir Starmer, Britain's current MP and former Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP. From 2008 to 2013, Starmer oversaw the Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, the body responsible for bringing charges in criminal cases. Critics argue that during his tenure, not enough was done to prosecute grooming gangs and only a handful of cases were prosecuted despite overwhelming evidence.
He still thinks that if you feel that these Pakistani predators should have the book thrown at them, that we should go after the people who turned their blind eye to the grooming gang scandal, he still thinks that's right-wing and racist. He still doesn't understand the problem. It's unbelievable.
It literally beggars belief that this man who leads our country should be so out of touch. And it shows that we have somebody at the helm of our country who is unfit for office.
This has led to growing public distrust, with Starmer now having one of the lowest approval ratings of any MP in recent history. Many believe that Starmer's failure to act decisively allowed the scandal to grow, leaving thousands of children at risk. Do you think Keir Starmer should be held accountable for his inaction? What consequences would be appropriate? Nevertheless, this scandal has sparked outrage across Britain and beyond. Many are appalled by what has been happening in their communities and trust in political leaders has hit an all-time low.
If anyone doubts that there is a double standard in modern Britain, as in many other Western liberal democracies these days, you just need to ask one question. What would have happened if it had been the other way round? What would have been the result if gangs of white working class men had been singling out underage Muslim Pakistani girls and gang them? Would we have passed it over? Would we have said that's a bit too awkward to talk about it? Would the police have just allowed it? Would the local councils have allowed it? Would the Pakistani community in Britain have allowed it? The answer to all of these things is, of course not. You just need to turn it the other way round, and you see the two-tier system in Britain at the moment, as in so many countries, because we cannot cope with the situation that generations of politicians have handed us.
A lot of people in the UK don't just see the grooming gang scandal as a failure of justice. They believe it was a full-blown cover-up. And what really pushes people over the edge? The fact that high-up officials still deny it or act like the problem does not exist.
That the grooming gang scandal is widely seen as a cover-up, actually, including by Labour voters. So 46% of people surveyed say that they think the scandal was actually exacerbated by a cover-up. 14%, that's 1/4, disagree.
Just how many grooming gangs have we got in London?
Can she define what she means by that? What does she mean by that?
You know full well what I mean by that. It's all over the television. You know exactly what I mean by that.
Let me just give a full answer. Can she be clear what she means by that? I'm not clear what she means.
Do we have those gangs in London? It's a simple question.
I'm not sure why she's so nervous to say what she means. What do you mean?
No. I am saying exactly what I mean.
I'm unclear, Chair, what is meant by the question. If she could spell it out, I can answer.
Exactly how much clearer do you want me to be?
Well, I'm still none the wiser why she's so nervous about saying what she means.
This growing frustration has led to a surge in support for Nigel Farage and his Reform Party, now the most popular political movement in Britain. Farage's party has gained traction by advocating for issues like illegal immigration, the decline of British culture, and the rise of crime. They've also made big promises to tackle the grooming scandal, resonating with voters who feel betrayed by mainstream politicians.
What we need and what we're calling for is a rifle shot inquiry, one that looks specifically at to what extent were gangs of Pakistani men raping young white girls. Because ultimately, it seems to me there's a deep racist element behind what happened. Now, I might be right, I might be wrong, but doesn't the country deserve a full, open national inquiry? And I'll say this, if the government won't do this, and I do believe there is now overwhelming support on all sides of the political spectrum for this, and Parliament should not be in denial about this. If it doesn't, then we will raise the money at Reform UK and appoint independent arbiters, because we need the truth to be out there.
Even billionaire Elon Musk initially supported Farage, though after Farage criticized Tommy Robinson, their alliance has since soured. Musk recently tweeted that Farage doesn't have what it takes, and that the Reform Party needs a new leader.
Public life, tough things get said. They get said by both sides of the debate. You're right, this man happens to be the richest man in the world.
This scandal has sparked outrage worldwide, leading to calls for a new national inquiry. Recently, the Conservative Party in Britain, led by Keir Starmer, pushed for this inquiry in Parliament. They exerted significant pressure on the Prime Minister, accusing him of a major cover-up.
Let us have the truth. The Prime Minister cannot tell the House the full scale of the scandal. He doesn't want questions asked of Labour politicians who may be complicit. He won't listen to the victims. He won't listen to the victims who are calling for a national inquiry. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister called for 9 inquiries in the last Parliament. Does he not see that by resisting this one, people will start to worry about a cover-up?
Keir Starmer argued that a new national inquiry would definitively address whether this scandal is rooted in cultural or racial issues.
Former Labour MP Anne Pryor said that there were councillors and MPs all over the country who knew what was going on but were terrified of being labelled racist. A national inquiry would ask if there was a racial or cultural motivation to some of these crimes where white girls were seen, as Jack Straw said, as easy meat. The member for Rotherham was sacked from Labour's front bench for speaking out about gangs. Does the Prime Minister now recognise that sacking people for telling the truth creates a chilling effect that means victims aren't listened to?
Unfortunately, the push for a new national inquiry did not succeed. The Prime Minister argued that enough inquiries have been conducted and that Britain should now focus on implementing their recommendations. However, many believe these inquiries were ineffective and did not achieve true justice for the survivors. A 2021 study found that 70% of grooming gang survivors struggled to maintain stable relationships or employment as adults.
You know, and I was ignored, and I was mocked, I was laughed at, you know, I was laughed at by certain police officers when I tried reporting the abuse. And that hasn't been easy. You know, so many of us was fobbed off. So these survivors need that support, they need that help, they need that care and nurture, not being fobbed off, not being laughed at. You know, they need therapists and stuff. But that costs money. And this is what this boils down to. That costs money. Money these governments aren't willing to spend on that.
Only a small number of perpetrators were jailed, often receiving minimal sentences, and many people claim that these gangs are still active across Britain today.
Led investigations into every part of the country where this is going on. So they launched this task force. In its first year, 2023 to 2024, it made over 550 arrests and protected 4,000 victims. They just revealed that there are thousands of victims still being identified in 1 year from a newly established force. It's so important to completely run over this myth that this is a thing of the past. This is some northern towns in the 2000s. No, this is here and now. This is across the country, everywhere now.
To confirm, a 2023 investigation by The Times revealed that grooming gangs are still active in at least 20 UK towns, with new cases being reported every year.
Because there are grooming gangs operating today, this is not a historical problem. We've currently got cases in Hull, in Barrow, in Oldham, in Rochdale, in South Wales. So, you know, this is not historical, and the police will have you believe it is historical.
The grooming gang scandal isn't just a failure of law enforcement. It's a failure of Britain itself. Vulnerable children were betrayed, justice was ignored, and those in power chose silence over action. But this must be a wake-up call. How did they let it get this far? How many warnings were ignored? How many victims were silenced? Britain can't afford to turn a blind eye any longer. So, what do you think? Who is truly to blame? Is this about politics, culture, religion, or something even deeper? And most importantly, what will it take to make sure this never happens again? Comment below, share your thoughts, and make your voice heard. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because if we stay silent, nothing will change. Europe, and especially Britain, must wake up.